If Moses was an Egyptian. In an earlier contribution to this periodical, I attempted to bring up a fresh argument in support of the hypothesis that the man Moses, the liberator and lawgiver of the Jewish people, was not a Jew but an Egyptian. It had long been observed that his name was derived from the Egyptian vocabulary, though the fact had not been properly appreciated. What I added was that the interpretation of the myth of exposure, which was linked with Moses, necessarily led to the inference that he was an Egyptian whom the needs of a people sought to make into a Jew. I remarked at the end of my paper that important and far-reaching implications followed from the hypothesis that Moses was an Egyptian, but that I was not prepared to argue publicly in favor of these implications, since they were based only on psychological probabilities and lacked any objective proof. The greater the importance of the views arrived at in this way, the more strongly one feels the need to beware of exposing them without a secure basis to the critical assaults of the world around one, like a bronze statue with feet of clay. Not even the most tempting probability is a protection against error. Even if all the parts of a problem seem to fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, one must reflect that what is probable is not necessarily the truth, and that the truth is not always probable. And lastly, it did not seem attractive to find oneself classed with the schoolmen and the Talmudists, who delight in exhibiting their ingenuity without regard to how remote from reality their thesis may be. Notwithstanding these hesitations, which weigh as much with me today as they did before, the outcome of my conflicting motives is a decision to produce the present sequel to my earlier communication. But once again, this is not the whole story, nor the most important part of the whole story. 1. If then Moses was an Egyptian, our first yield from this hypothesis is a fresh enigma, and one which it is hard to solve. If a people or a tribe sets out upon a great undertaking, it is only to be expected that one of its members will take his place as their leader, or will be chosen for that post. But it is not easy to guess what could induce an aristocratic Egyptian, a prince perhaps, or a priest or high official, to put himself at the head of a crowd of immigrant foreigners at a backward level of civilization, and to leave his country with them. The well-known contempt felt by the Egyptians for foreign nationals makes such a proceeding particularly unlikely. Indeed, I could well believe that this has been precisely why even those historians who have recognized that the man's name was Egyptian, and who have ascribed to him all the wisdom of the Egyptians, have been unwilling to accept the obvious possibility that Moses was an Egyptian. This first difficulty is promptly followed by another. We must not forget that Moses was not only the political leader of the Jews settled in Egypt, but was also their lawgiver and educator, and forced them into the service of a new religion, which to this very day is known after him as the Mosaic one. But is it so easy for one single man to create a new religion? And if anyone wishes to influence another person's religion, would he not most naturally convert him to his own? The Jewish people in Egypt was certainly not without a religion of some form or other, and if Moses, who gave them a new one, was an Egyptian, the presumption cannot be put aside that this other new religion was the Egyptian one. There is something that stands in the way of this possibility, the fact of there being the most violent contrast between the Jewish religion, which is attributed to Moses, and the religion of Egypt. The former is a rigid monotheism on the grand scale. There is only one God. He is the sole God, omnipotent, unapproachable. His aspect is more than human eyes can tolerate. No image must be made of him. Even his name may not be spoken. In the Egyptian religion, there is an almost innumerable host of deities of varying dignity and origin. A few personifications of great natural forces such as heaven and earth, sun and moon, an occasional abstraction such as Maat, truth or justice, or a caricature such as the dwarf-like Bes. But most of them local gods, dating from the period when the country was divided into numerous provinces, with the shape of animals, as though they had not yet completed their evolution from the old totem animals, with no sharp distinctions between them, and scarcely differing in the functions allotted to them. The hymns in honor of these gods say almost the same things about all of them, and identify them with one another unhesitatingly, in a manner hopelessly confusing to us. The names of gods are combined with one another, so that one of them may almost be reduced to being an epithet of the other. Thus, in the heyday of the New Kingdom, the principal god of the city of Thebes was called Amen-Re. The first part of this compound stands for the ram-headed god of the city, while Re is the name of the falcon-headed sun god of On, Heliopolis. Magical and ceremonial acts, charms, and amulets dominated the service of these gods as they did the daily life of the Egyptians. Some of these differences may easily be derived from the fundamental contrast between a strict monotheism and an unrestricted polytheism. Others are evidently the result of a difference in spiritual and intellectual level, since one of these religions is very close to primitive phases of development, while the other has risen to the heights of sublime abstraction. It may be due to these two factors that one occasionally has an impression that the contrast between the Mosaic and the Egyptian religions is a deliberate one and has been intentionally heightened. When, for instance, one of them condemns magic and sorcery in the severest terms, while in the other they proliferate with the greatest luxuriance, or when the insatiable appetite of the Egyptians for embodying their gods in clay, stone, and metal, to which our museums owe so much today, is confronted with the harsh prohibition against making an image of any living or imagined creature. But there is still another contrast between the two religions which is not met by the explanations we have attempted. No other people of antiquity did so much, as the Egyptians, to deny death, or took such pains to make existence in the next world possible. And accordingly Osiris, the god of the dead, the ruler of this other world, was the most popular and undisputed of all the gods of Egypt. On the other hand, the ancient Jewish religion renounced immortality entirely. The possibility of existence continuing after death is nowhere and never mentioned. And this is all the more remarkable, since later experiences have shown that belief in an afterlife is perfectly well compatible with a monotheist religion. It was our hope that the hypothesis that Moses was an Egyptian would turn out to be fruitful and illuminating in various directions. But the first conclusion we drew from that hypothesis, that the new religion which he gave to the Jews was his own Egyptian one, has been invalidated by our realization of the different, and indeed contradictory, character of the two religions. 2. Another possibility is opened to us by a remarkable event in the history of the Egyptian religion, an event which has only lately been recognized and appreciated. It remains possible that the religion which Moses gave to his Jewish people was nevertheless his own, that it was an Egyptian religion, though not the Egyptian religion. In the glorious 18th dynasty, under which Egypt first became a world power, a young pharaoh came to the throne in about the year 1375 BC. To begin with, he was called, like his father, Amenhotep IV. But later he changed his name, and not only his name. This king set about forcing a new religion of his Egyptian subjects, a religion which ran contrary to their thousands of years-old traditions and to all the familiar habits of their lives. It was a strict monotheism, the first attempt of the kind, so far as we know, in the history of the world, and along with the belief in a single god, religious intolerance was inevitably born, which had previously been alien to the ancient world and remained so long afterwards. The reign of Amenhotep, however, lasted for only 17 years. Very soon after his death, in 1358 BC, the new religion was swept away, and the memory of the heretic king was proscribed. What little we know of him is derived from the ruins of the new royal capital, which he built and dedicated to his god, and from the inscriptions in the rock tombs adjacent to it. Whatever we can learn about this remarkable and indeed unique personality is deserving of the highest interest. Every novelty must have its preliminaries and preconditions in something earlier. The origins of Egyptian monotheism can be traced back a little way with some certainty. For a considerable time, tendencies had been at work among the priesthood of the Sun Temple at On, Heliopolis, in the direction of developing the idea of a universal God and of emphasizing the ethical side of his nature. Ma'at, the goddess of truth, order, and justice, was a daughter of the sun god Re. During the reign of Amenhotep III, the father and predecessor of the reformer, the worship of the sun god had already gained a new impetus, probably in opposition to Amun of Thebes, who had become too powerful. A very ancient name of the sun god, Aten or Atum, was brought into fresh prominence, and the young king found in this Aten religion a movement ready to hand, which he did not have to be the first to inspire, but of which he could become an adherent. The political conditions in Egypt had begun at this time to exercise a lasting influence on the Egyptian religion. As a result of the military exploits of the great conqueror, Thutmose III, Egypt had become a world power. The empire now included Nubia in the south, Palestine, Syria, and a part of Mesopotamia in the north. This imperialism was reflected in religion as universalism and monotheism. Since the pharaoh's responsibilities now embraced not only Egypt but Nubia and Syria as well, deity too was obliged to abandon its national limitation. And, just as the pharaoh was the sole and unrestricted ruler of the world known to the Egyptians, this must also apply to the Egyptians' new deity. Moreover, with the extension of the empire's frontiers, it was natural that Egypt would become more accessible to foreign influences. Some of the royal wives were Asiatic princesses, and it is possible that direct incitements to monotheism even made their way in from Syria. Amenhotep never denied his adherence to the sun cult of On. In the two hymns to the Aten which have survived in the rock tombs, and which were probably composed by him himself, he praises the sun as the creator and preserver of all living things, both inside and outside Egypt, with an ardor which is not repeated till many centuries later in the Psalms in honor of the Jewish god Yahweh. He was not content, however, with this astonishing anticipation of the scientific discovery of the effect of solar radiation. There is no doubt that he went a step further, that he did not worship the sun as a material object, but as the symbol of a divine being whose energy was manifested in its rays. We should not, however, be doing justice to the king if we regarded him merely as an adherent or promoter of an Aten religion already in existence before his time. His activity was a far more energetic intervention. He introduced something new, which for the first time converted the doctrine of a universal God into monotheism, the factor of exclusiveness. In one of his hymns he declares expressly, "O thou sole God, beside whom there is no other." And we must not forget that in assessing the new doctrine, a knowledge of its positive contents is not enough. Its negative side is almost equally important, a knowledge of what it rejects. It would be a mistake, too, to suppose that the new religion was completed at a single blow and sprang to life fully armed, like Athene out of the head of Zeus. Everything suggests, rather, that in the course of the reign of Amenhotep, it increased little by little to ever greater clarity, consistency, harshness, and intolerance. It is likely that this development came about under the influence of the violent opposition to the king's reforms which arose among the priests of Amun. In the 6th year of the reign of Amenhotep, this antagonism had reached such a pitch that the king changed his name, of which the prescribed name of the god Amun formed a part. Instead of Amenhotep, he now called himself Akhenaten. But it was not only from his own name that he expunged that of the detested god. He erased it too from every inscription, even where it occurred in the name of his father, Amenhotep III. Soon after changing his name, Akhenaten abandoned the Amun-dominated city of Thebes and built himself a new royal capital lower down the river, which he named Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Its ruined site is now known as Tel el Amarna. The persecution by the king fell most harshly upon Amun, but not on him alone. Throughout the kingdom, temples were closed, divine service forbidden, temple property confiscated. Indeed, the king's seal went so far that he had the ancient monuments examined in order to have the word God obliterated in them where it occurred in the plural. It is not to be wondered at that these measures taken by Akhenaten provoked a mood of fanatical vindictiveness among the suppressed priesthood and unsatisfied common people, and this was able to find free expression after the king's death. The Aten religion had not become popular. It had probably remained restricted to a narrow circle surrounding the king's person. Akhenaten's end remains veiled in obscurity. We hear of a few short-lived, shadowy successors from his own family. His son-in-law, Tutankhamun, was already compelled to return to Thebes and to replace the name of the god Aten in his name by that of Amun. There followed a period of anarchy till, in 1350 BC, a general, Horemheb, succeeded in restoring order. The glorious 18th dynasty was at an end, and simultaneously its conquests in Nubia and Asia were lost. During this gloomy interregnum, the ancient religions of Egypt were re-established. The Aten religion was abolished. Akhenaten's royal city was destroyed and plundered, and his memory proscribed as that of a criminal. It is with a particular purpose that we shall now emphasize a few points among the negative characteristics of the Aten religion. In the first place, everything to do with myths, magic, and sorcery is excluded from it. In the next place, the manner in which the sun god was represented was no longer, as in the past, by a small pyramid and a falcon, but, and this seems almost prosaic, by a round disk with rays proceeding from it, which end in human hands. In spite of all the exuberant art of the Amarna period, no other representation of the sun god, no personal image of the Aten, has been found, and it may confidently be said that none will be found. Lastly, there was complete silence about the god of the dead, Osiris, and the kingdom of the dead. Neither the hymns nor the tomb inscriptions have any knowledge of what perhaps lay closest to the hearts of the Egyptians. The contrast to the popular religion cannot be more clearly demonstrated. 3. I should now like to venture on this conclusion. If Moses was an Egyptian, and if he communicated his own religion to the Jews, it must have been Akhenaten's, the Aten religion. I have already compared the Jewish religion with the popular religion of Egypt and shown the opposition between them. I must now make a comparison between the Jewish and the Aten religions in the expectation of proving their original identity. This, I am aware, will present no easy task. Thanks to the vindictiveness of the priests of Amun, we may perhaps know too little of the Aten religion. We only know the Mosaic religion in its final shape, as it was fixed by the Jewish priesthood some 800 years later in post-exilic times. If, in spite of this unfavorable state of the material, we find a few indications which favor our hypothesis, we shall be able to set a high value on them. There will be a short path to proving our thesis that the Mosaic religion was none other than that of the Aten, namely, if we had a confession of faith, a declaration. But I fear we shall be told that this path is closed to us. The Jewish confession of faith, as is well known, runs, Skema Jizroel Adonai Elohenu Adonai Echad. If it is not merely by chance that the name of the Egyptian Aten, or Atum, sounds like the Hebrew word Adonai, Lord, and the name of the Syrian deity Adonis, but if it is due to a primeval kinship of speech and meaning, then the Jewish formula might be translated thus: Hear, O Israel, our God, Aten, Adonai, is a sole God. Unfortunately, I am totally incompetent to answer this question, and I have been able to find but little about it in the literature of the subject. But in all probability, this is making things too easy for us. In any case, we shall have to come back once more to the problems concerning the name of the god. The similarities, as well as the differences between the two religions, are easily discernible without giving us much light. Both of them were forms of a strict monotheism, and we shall be inclined a priori to trace back what they had in common to this fundamental characteristic. Jewish monotheism behaved in some respects even more harshly than the Egyptian. For instance, in forbidding pictorial representations of any kind, the most essential difference is to be seen, apart from their gods' names, in the fact that the Jewish religion was entirely without sun worship, in which the Egyptian one still found support. When we were making the comparison with the popular religion of Egypt, we had an impression that, apart from the fundamental contrast, a factor of intentional contradiction played a part in the difference between the two religions. This impression seems to be justified if now, in making the comparison, we replace the Jewish religion by the Aten religion, which, as we know, was developed by Akhenaten in deliberate hostility to the popular one. We were rightly surprised to find that the Jewish religion would have nothing to do with the next world or a life after death, though a doctrine of that kind would have been compatible with the strictest monotheism. But this surprise vanishes if we turn back from the Jewish to the Aten religion and suppose that this refusal was taken over from it, since, for Akhenaten, it was a necessity in his fight against the popular religion, in which Osiris, the god of the dead, played a greater part, perhaps than any god in the upper world. The agreement between the Jewish and the Aten religions on this important point is the first strong argument in favor of our thesis. We shall learn that it is not the only one. Moses did not only give the Jews a new religion. It can be stated with equal certainty that he introduced the custom of circumcision to them. This fact is of decisive importance for our problem and has scarcely ever been considered. It is true that the biblical account contradicts this more than once. On the one hand, it traces circumcision back to the patriarchal age as a mark of a covenant between God and Abraham. On the other hand, it describes, in a quite particularly obscure passage, how God was angry with Moses for having neglected a custom which had become holy, and sought to kill him, but that his wife, a Midianite, saved her husband from God's wrath by quickly performing the operation. These, however, are distortions which should not lead us astray. Later on we shall discover the reason for them. The fact remains that there is only one answer to the question of where the Jews derived the custom of circumcision from, namely from Egypt. Herodotus, the father of history, tells us that the custom of circumcision had long been indigenous in Egypt, and his statements are confirmed by the findings in mummies, and indeed by pictures on the walls of tombs. No other people of the Eastern Mediterranean, so far as we know, practice this custom. It may safely be presumed that the Semites, Babylonians, and Sumerians were uncircumcised. The Bible story itself says this is so of the inhabitants of Canaan. It is a necessary premise to the adventure of Jacob's daughter and the prince of Shechem. The possibility that the Jews acquired the custom of circumcision during their sojourn in Egypt in some way other than in connection with the religious teaching of Moses may be rejected as completely without foundation. Now, taking it as certain that circumcision was a universal popular custom in Egypt, let us for a moment adopt the ordinary hypothesis that Moses was a Jew who sought to free his compatriots from bondage in Egypt and led them to develop an independent and self-conscious national existence in another country, which was what in fact happened. What sense could it have, in that case, that he should at the same time impose on them a troublesome custom, which even, to some extent, made them into Egyptians, and which must keep permanently alive their memory of Egypt, whereas his efforts could only be aimed in the opposite direction, towards alienating his people from the land of their bondage, and overcoming their longing for the flesh-pots of Egypt? No, the fact from which we started, and the hypothesis which we added to it, are so incompatible with each other that we may be bold enough to reach this conclusion. If Moses gave the Jews not only a new religion, but also the commandment for circumcision, he was not a Jew, but an Egyptian. And in that case, the Mosaic religion was probably an Egyptian one, and, in view of its contrast to the popular religion, the religion of the Aten, with which the later Jewish religion agrees in some remarkable respects. I have pointed out that my hypothesis that Moses was not a Jew but an Egyptian created a fresh riddle. His course of conduct, which seemed easily intelligible in a Jew, was ununderstandable in an Egyptian. If, however, we place Moses in the time of Akhenaten and suppose him in contact with that pharaoh, the riddle vanishes and the possibility is revealed of motives which will answer all our questions. Let us start from the assumption that Moses was an aristocratic and prominent man, perhaps in fact a member of the royal house, as the legend says of him. He was undoubtedly aware of his great capacities, ambitious and energetic. He may even have played with the notion of one day being the leader of his people, of becoming the kingdom's ruler. Being close to the pharaoh, he was a convinced adherent of the new religion, whose basic thoughts he had made his own. When the king died and the reaction set in, he saw all his hopes and prospects destroyed. If he was not prepared to abjure all the convictions that were so dear to him, Egypt had nothing more to offer him. He had lost his country. In this predicament, he found an unusual solution. Akhenaten, the dreamer, had alienated his people and let his empire fall to pieces. The more energetic nature of Moses was more at home with the plan of founding a new kingdom, of finding a new people to whom he would present for their worship the religion which Egypt had disdained. It was, we can see, a heroic attempt to combat destiny, to compensate in two directions for the losses in which Akhenaten's catastrophe had involved him. Perhaps he was at that time governor of the frontier province, Goshen, in which certain Semitic tribes had settled, perhaps as early as in the Hyksos period. These he chose to be his new people, a historic decision. He came to an agreement with them, put himself at their head, and carried the exodus through by strength of hand. In complete contrast to the biblical tradition, we may presume that this exodus took place peacefully and unpursued. The authority of Moses made this possible, and at that time there was no central administration which might have interfered with it. According to this construction of ours, the exodus from Egypt would have occurred during the period between 1358 and 1350 BC, that is, after Akhenaten's death and before Horemheb's re-establishment of state authority. The goal of the migration could only have been the land of Canaan. After the collapse of the Egyptian domination, hordes of warlike Aramaeans had erupted into that region, conquering and plundering, and had shown in that way where a capable people might win fresh land for themselves. We learn of these warriors from the letters found in 1887 in the ruined city of Amarna. There they are called Habiru, and the name was transferred, we do not know how, to the later Jewish invaders, Hebrews, who cannot be intended in the Amarna letters. South of Palestine, too, in Canaan, there lived the tribes which were the nearest relatives of the Jews who were now making their way out of Egypt. The motives which we have discovered for the Exodus as a whole apply also to the introduction of circumcision. We are familiar with the attitude adopted by people, both nations and individuals, to this primeval usage, which is scarcely understood any longer. Those who do not practice it look on it as very strange and are a little horrified by it, but those who have adopted circumcision are proud of it. They feel exalted by it, ennobled as it were, and look down with contempt on the others whom they regard as unclean. Even to this day, a Turk will abuse a Christian as an uncircumcised dog. It may be supposed that Moses, who, being an Egyptian, was himself circumcised, shared this attitude. The Jews with whom he departed from his country were to serve him as a superior substitute for the Egyptians he had left behind. On no account must the Jews be inferior to them. He wished to make them into a holy nation, as is expressly stated in the biblical text. And as a mark of this consecration, he introduced among them, too, the custom which made them at least the equals of the Egyptians. And he could not only welcome it if they were to be isolated by such a sign and kept apart from the foreign peoples among whom their wanderings would lead them, just as the Egyptians themselves had kept apart from all foreigners. Later on, however, Jewish tradition behaved as though it were put at a disadvantage by the inference we have been drawing. If it were to be admitted that circumcision was an Egyptian custom introduced by Moses, that would be almost as much as to recognize that the religion delivered to them by Moses was an Egyptian one too. There were good reasons for denying that fact, so the truth about circumcision must also be contradicted. 4. At this point, I expect to be met by an objection to my hypothesis. This placed Moses, an Egyptian, in the Akhenaten period. It derived his decision to take over the Jewish people from the political circumstances in the country at that time, and it recognized the religion that he presented to or imposed on his protege as the Aten religion, which had actually collapsed in Egypt itself. I expect to be told that I have brought forward this structure of conjectures with too much positiveness, for which there is no basis in the material. This objection is, I think, unjustified. I have already laid stress on the factor of doubt in my introductory remarks. I have, as it were, placed that factor outside the brackets, and I may be allowed to save myself the trouble of repeating it in connection with each item inside them. I may continue the discussion with a few critical remarks of my own. The kernel of my hypothesis, the dependence of Jewish monotheism on the monotheist episode in Egyptian history, has been suspected and mentioned by various writers. I spare myself the trouble of quoting these opinions here, since none of them is able to indicate how this influence can have come into operation. Even though, in our view, that influence remains linked to the figure of Moses, we ought also to mention some other possibilities in addition to the one we prefer. It must not be supposed that the fall of the official Aten religion brought the monotheist current in Egypt to a complete stop. The priesthood at On, from which it started, survived the catastrophe and may have continued to bring under the sway of its trend of ideas generations after Akhenaten's. Thus the action taken by Moses is still conceivable even if he did not live at the time of Akhenaten and did not fall under his personal influence, if he was only an adherent or perhaps a member of the priesthood of On. This possibility would postpone the date of the Exodus and bring it closer to the date which is usually adopted in the 13th century, but it has nothing else to recommend it. Our insight into the motives of Moses would be lost, and the facilitation of the Exodus by the prevailing anarchy in the country would no longer apply. The succeeding kings of the 19th dynasty established a strong regime. It was only during the period immediately after the heretic king's death that there was a convergence of all the conditions, external and internal alike, that were favorable to the Exodus. The Jews possess a copious literature apart from the Bible, in which the legends and myths are to be found which grew up in the course of centuries round the imposing figure of their first leader and the founder of their religion, and which have both illuminated and obscured it. Scattered in this material, there may be fragments of trustworthy tradition for which no room was found in the Pentateuch. A legend of this sort gives an engaging account of how the ambition of the man Moses found expression even in his childhood. Once, when Pharaoh had taken him in his arms and playfully lifted him high in the air, the little 3-year-old boy snatched the crown from the king's head and put it on his own. This portent alarmed the king, who did not fail to consult his wise men about it. There are stories elsewhere of his victorious military actions as an Egyptian general in Ethiopia, and, in this connection, how he fled from Egypt because he had reason to be afraid of the envy of a party at court or of Pharaoh himself. The biblical account itself attributes some features to Moses to which credence may well be given. It describes him as being of an irascible nature, flaring up easily, as when, in indignation, he slew the brutal overseer who was ill-treating a Jewish workman, or when, in his anger at the people's apostasy, he broke the tables of the law which he had brought down from the mount of God, Sinai. Indeed, God himself punished him in the end for an impatient deed, but we are not told what it was. Since a trait of this kind is not one that would serve for his glorification, it may perhaps correspond to a historical truth. Nor can the possibility be excluded that some of the character traits which the Jews included in their early picture of their God, describing him as jealous, severe, and ruthless, may have been, at bottom, derived from a recollection of Moses. For in fact, it was not an invisible God, but the man Moses who brought them out of Egypt. Another trait attributed to Moses has a special claim to our interest. Moses is said to have been slow of speech. He must have suffered from an inhibition or disorder of speech. Consequently, in his supposed dealings with Pharaoh, he needed the support of Aaron, who is called his brother. This again may be a historical truth, and would make a welcome contribution to presenting a lively picture of the great man, but it may also have another and more important significance. It may recall, slightly distorted, the fact that Moses spoke another language and could not communicate with his Semitic Neo-Egyptians without an interpreter, at all events at the beginning of their relations. A fresh confirmation, then, of the thesis that Moses was an Egyptian. Now, however, or so it seems, our work has reached a provisional end. For the moment, we can draw no further conclusions from our hypothesis that Moses was an Egyptian, whether it has been proved or not. No historian can regard the biblical account of Moses and the Exodus as anything other than a pious piece of imaginative fiction, which has recast a remote tradition for the benefit of its own tendentious purposes. The original form of that tradition is unknown to us. We should be glad to discover what the distorting purposes were, but we are kept in the dark by our ignorance of the historical events. The fact that our reconstruction leaves no room for a number of showpieces in the Bible story, such as the 10 plagues, the passage of the Red Sea, and the solemn law-giving on Mount Sinai, this does not disconcert us. But we cannot treat it as a matter of indifference if we find ourselves in contradiction to the findings of the sober historical researches of the present day. These modern historians, of whom we may take Eduard Meyer, 1906, as a representative, agree with the Bible story on one decisive point. They too are of opinion that the Jewish tribes, which later developed into the people of Israel, took on a new religion at a certain point in time. But in their view, this did not take place in Egypt, or at the foot of a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula, but in a certain locality known as Meribah Kadesh, an oasis distinguished by its wealth of springs and wells in the stretch of country south of Palestine, between the eastern exit from the Sinai Peninsula and the western border of Arabia. There they took over the worship of a god Yahweh, probably from the neighboring Arabian tribe of Midianites. It seems likely that other tribes in the vicinity were also followers of this god. Yahweh was unquestionably a volcano god. Now, as is well known, Egypt is without volcanoes, and the mountains of the Sinai Peninsula have never been volcanic. On the other hand, there are volcanoes which may have been active till recent times along the western border of Arabia. So one of these mountains must have been the Sinai Horeb, which was regarded as the home of Yahweh. In spite of all the revisions to which the biblical story was subjected, the original picture of the god's character can, according to Eduard Meyer, be reconstructed. He was an uncanny, bloodthirsty demon who went about by night and shunned the light of day. The mediator between God and the people in the founding of this religion was named Moses. He was the son-in-law of the Midianite priest Jethro, and was keeping his flocks when he received the summons from God. He was also visited by Jethro at Kadesh and given some advice by him. Though Eduard Meyer says it is true that he never doubted that there was some historical core in the story of the sojourn in Egypt and the catastrophe to the Egyptians, he evidently does not know how to place and what use to make of this fact, which he recognizes. The only thing he is prepared to derive from Egypt is the custom of circumcision. He adds two important indications which go to confirm our previous arguments. First, that Joshua ordered the people to be circumcised in order to roll away the reproach, i.e. contempt, of Egypt from off you. And secondly, a quotation from Herodotus saying that the Phoenicians, no doubt the Jews, and the Syrians of Palestine themselves admit that they learnt the custom of the Egyptians. But he has little to say in favor of an Egyptian Moses. The Moses we know is the ancestor of the priests of Kadesh, that is, a figure from a genealogical legend, standing in relation to a cult, and not a historical personality. Thus, apart from those who accept tradition root and branch as historical truth, no one who treats him as a historical figure has been able to give any content to him, to represent him as a concrete individual, or to point out what he may have done and what his historical work may have been. On the other hand, Meyer is never tired of insisting on the relation of Moses to Kadesh and Midian. The figure of Moses, which is intimately bound up with Midian and the cult centers in the desert, and this figure of Moses, then, is inseparably linked with Kadesh, Massa, and Meribah, and this is supplemented by his being the son-in-law of the Midianite priest. His link with the Exodus, on the contrary, and the whole story of his youth are entirely secondary and simply the consequence of the interpolation of Moses into a connected and continuous legendary story. Meyer also points out that the themes included in the story of the youth of Moses were one and all dropped later. Moses in Midian is no longer an Egyptian and grandson of Pharaoh, but a shepherd to whom Yahweh revealed himself. In telling of the plagues, there is no longer any talk of his former connections, though effective use might easily have been made of them, and the command to kill the newborn sons of the Israelites is completely forgotten. In the Exodus and the destruction of the Egyptians, Moses plays no part whatever. He is not even mentioned. The heroic character which the legend of his childhood presupposes is totally absent from the later Moses. He is only the man of God, a miracle worker equipped by Yahweh with supernatural powers. We cannot dispute the impression that this Moses of Kadesh and Midian, to whom tradition could actually attribute the erection of a brazen serpent as a god of healing, is someone quite other than the aristocratic Egyptian inferred by us, who presented the people with a religion in which all magic and spells were proscribed in the strictest terms. Our Egyptian Moses is no less different, perhaps, from the Midianite Moses than is the universal god Aten from the demon Yahweh in his home on the Mount of God. And if we have any faith at all in the pronouncements of the recent historians, we shall have to admit that the thread which we have tried to spin from our hypothesis that Moses was an Egyptian has broken for the second time. And this time, as it seems, with no hope of mending.